Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your patience in waiting. We have managed to have a live connection with Dublin, where Clare and Marianne Bolger are in the little small window at the bottom of the screen. And they're going to kick off the day. We've tried to put together a quite provocative program for the education strand. We do want to generate quite a lot of discussion. We'll try to make the discussion work after the presentation. I'll have to repeat questions so that the interpreters can hear them and so on, so we'll do it in a bit of a organized way. But there will be room for this. Guys, are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Please remember, close the microphone and speak up. And
Okay.
You're ready to go. Let's see.
Thanks, Jerry. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear us.
Okay, sorry,
right.
hold on. Guys, we need the volume higher. Can we get the volume higher for this?
Hello. I'm speaking loud.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hello.
Yes.
Right. It's early in the morning. This first talk is via Skype. The caffeine hasn't had time to work yet. And the word epistemology is up on the screen. So we thought we'd begin with some transatlantic virtual audience participation. So can we have some hands up, please? Hands up here, who's a typeface designer? Who's a typographer? Who is a researcher? A historian? An academic? A practitioner? So that was all very helpful to us here because we can't actually see you. Nevertheless, we think that this is a good way to begin because we wanted, at least in your room, to begin by acknowledging the diverse range of people that ATypI comprises and that are attending the Strand today, and to suggest that research in typography occupies a far wider spectrum than the rather narrow or specific domain of education. Our aim today is to raise some questions about how research, especially academic research, is perceived and understood in the context of typographic education and practice.
One of the reasons that we ask this is that we often work together as a research partnership. While there is a sliding scale of definition, by and large, Marianne is a design historian and I'm a graphic designer. Both of us teach and are doing PhDs, and the issues that we encounter often arise out of the seemingly dichotomous nature of this shared vein of inquiry.
A pet peeve of ours is the false dichotomy that's often drawn between theory and practice, or if you like, history and studio. We argue that this problem is not simply about disciplinary territoriality in education. It reflects an existing resistance to and misunderstanding of academic research in the design profession itself. The first example of what we're talking about came from the observation that ATypI issues calls for presentations rather than the more common call for papers. So in this paper, we are going to draw on our experiences of organising the ATypI conference in Dublin in 2010.
Something we found interesting and quite relevant in the terms of today's discussion was an exchange that took place on a rooftop in Mexico City in 2009 at a planning meeting between members of the organising committee about the use of the word paper as opposed to presentation to describe the call for submissions. It was suggested that the term call for papers could be off-putting for some of ATypI's audience. Such concerns about the likely response of practitioners to the idea of submitting a paper seem to suggest that practitioners are either unable, unwilling, or both to engage with the currencies of scholarly activity. The idea of a presentation as opposed to a paper also touches on a much larger problem. We argue that within this context, it renders participants passive receivers of information or even entertainment, rather than active generators of their own epistemology.
So, the term academic is often used by practitioners as a synonym for boring. as you can see here in a selection of tweets harvested from last year's conference. Or worse, academic language is accused of being, to use Paulo expression, exclusionary language. Of course, the problem here, we'd argue, is not the academics, but the reading of something off a script. Not what I'm doing now at all, I promise. That's the real issue that needs to be addressed, because nobody wants this to happen. More recently, while organising the Year of Irish Design's Face Forward typography conference, we were surprised by the level of resistance to some of the language used in our calls for papers, in particular the term epistemology, which our colleague and friend Lorenzo Tonti decided was actually biscotti. What is often taken for jargon by those of outside of a particular field is actually a highly coded and meaningful set of terms used to distinguish levels of specificity not necessary for non-users. My interior design colleagues, for example, refer to all visual renderings of lettering as fonts, or better still, Times New Roman. But I don't think I'm being exclusionary when I suggest that they may want to distinguish between, say, uncial and sans serif. Often a call for clarity presupposes transparency of meaning, as if the meaning existed outside of and before the word, when, as we've all experienced, when you go and try to define something, meaning is constantly deferred. Words are not transparent. You can't simply substitute one for another. Our use of the word epistemology is not to obscure meaning, but actually to clarify it.
So, what is epistemology? We and Wikipedia describe it as knowing that as opposed to knowing how. In other words, it loosely equates with the difference between propositional knowledge and tacit knowledge. For example, knowing that this is current incorrectly is one type of knowledge, and knowing how to correct it is another. Currently, the epistemology of graphic design and typography appears to comprise a set of formal and compositional rules or principles, a canonical history of individual designers, or the historical development of formal attributes. But this only deals with the formal aspects and material processes of typography. What else constitutes the epistemology of a discipline?
Closer to the microphone, please, guys.
Yeah, okay. And what else constitutes the epistemology of a discipline, and how is epistemology more than just a set of principles? Why isn't this going down? Okay, great, yeah. Okay, well, for example, in my PhD research on the Falls Road in West Belfast, the use of Gaelic typography, which proliferates the area, appears to function as a distinct tool of self-identification or a boundary marker. The use of Gaelic lettering in this way raises questions of who it is directed at and who that message either includes or excludes in its address. Upon further analysis of the exact character of these questions and how Gaelic typography and lettering can engender a slight yet tangible feeling of alienation to those not from a Catholic background in this context, their social and cultural as opposed to formal or historical nature revealed itself. These questions activate themes of identity, belonging and exclusion, materializing and lodging themselves at the interface of the relationship between language, visual artifacts, representation and social or cultural life and typography. That these instances of cultural identification occur via typographic representation is not only compelling in its own right, but also because the questions that arise here cannot be answered to any satisfactory extent currently by an engagement with the literature of the subject domain of typography and graphic design. Go on. Very little of the literature of our discipline can tell me why one ex-prisoner that I interviewed said, While it's in prison, it's almost like you didn't choose the typeface chose you. Further, that these types of questions are not widely acknowledged either in graphic design, practice, typography, or pedagogy as a regular subject for discussion in the main domain discourse also interests me.
So, epistemology is also the heading under which we can situate the heated debates Clare and I have over, for example, the location of manhole covers on the spectrum of typographic interest. And this is one issue where Clare and I part company. To Clare, she finds the people who find manhole covers and other such details interesting.
But Marianne considers manhole covers interesting in themselves.
Which is perhaps a little bit more than you need to know this early in the morning. But here's another interesting tweet. So sorry, Eve, we are now going to discuss some of the consequences for how research is perceived and understood in the context of typographic education and practice, of what we argue is the discipline's lack of epistemological framework. The number of journals dedicated solely to the publishing of research in the fields of typography and visual communication is very low. What there is rarely finds its way back into the studio at undergraduate level. Further, research published in discipline-focused, peer-reviewed journals does not tend, as Robin Kinross has argued, to be highly valued by those engaged in practice. As a result of this, he claims, the academic discussion of typography and design in general is too often hermetic and unreal, in unholy partnership with the proud anti-intellectualism of many practicing designers.
In addition, in education, false binaries between theory and practice or industry and the academy are frequently reinforced. Further, a lack of explicitly theoretically informed studio practice and a dearth of scholarly writing emanating from within practice has led to a perception of graphic design and typography as marginal activities which do not contribute at a constitutive level in society. For example, revealing observations come from such apparently neutral activities as compiling a reading list for our Typography Ireland seminar group. When we made an attempt to put together a bibliography for our reading group last year, we were presented with a difficulty. Only a very small percentage of the large volume of material suggested as being relevant by our attendees was actually peer-reviewed.
So here's an example. If I want to find an article for my MA students on the late, great Adrian Frutiger, I go to the Design and Applied Arts Index, the largest database of design-related publications, and I find 38 published articles, of which how many is a peer-reviewed article? Well, 1. So perhaps it might be better to try a more general academic database. I tried Academic Search Complete. I carried out the same search, and I found 5 articles, which makes you wonder what constitutes completeness in this context. I pressed the peer review button and no results were found.
It doesn't just end there. The issue is further underlined when one considers that unless we put iMagazine on the required reading list for students, we're not really teaching them properly. Yet iMagazine, despite featuring key writing on contemporary graphic design and typography, is a trade magazine. Thus, the Academy is forced to go beyond itself for its own required primary reading. This is just one example. Others are Design Observer, Print Magazine, etc., all of which are invaluable to the scholar of graphic design and typography, and all non-peer reviewed. While we acknowledge the presence of peer-reviewed journals such as Design Issues, Visible Language, and Visual Communication, very little of the knowledge produced there finds its way back into the studio in a more general sense. So what does that suggest? It would appear that because the locus of graphic design knowledge is positioned largely outside of the Academy, the locus of knowledge about practice is as well. As Audrey Bennett has noted, what exists is an intellectual chasm between practice and research, with practitioners leading the way.
So with regard to the compilation of the Typography Ireland reading list, This leaves us in an unenviable position of having no recognised criteria by which to decide on its contents. So we were actually left in the position of curating most of the reading list. Counting, the Academy might say that only one or none of the 38 articles could be described as such. So instead of starting the discussion at a level that examines or evaluates the inclusion of a relevant text within an established critical framework, we get embroiled in the various subjectivities that come into play based on the proclivities of the participants. And this also goes for conferences. In the absence of peer review, and certainly blind peer review, the programme of speakers is curated and tends to prioritise well-known names. And this also has implications for gender representation at conferences, stark representations, as has recently been the subject of much discussion on Twitter.
We are also more likely to fall prey to the construction of a knowledge base that meets the needs and represents the views of dominant subjectivities. As Simon Downes has noted, graphic design does not know what it knows. The significance of this comment also chimes with Christina Niederer's observation that tacit knowledge forms a substantial proportion of the knowledge drawn upon in order to practice graphic design and typography. Implicit prioritization of propositional knowledge seems to exclude certain kinds of formats of knowledge associated with practice, which are often called practical, experiential, personal, or tacit knowledge, and which evade verbal articulation. This all relates to the wider issue of the Academy's difficulty in integrating the type of knowledge generated by practice-led disciplines, for example, graphic design, fine art, and even something like nursing, for example. Thus far, its method of hypothesizing and substantiating inquiry through research is based entirely on language-based propositional knowledge, which makes it difficult to account for and validate knowledge based on procedural or experiential models. Okay. Further, the writing down of knowledge that can usefully be deployed within the context of practice is only successful if that knowledge can be integrated into the practical knowledge of the art. It cannot replace this knowledge. Paulo Scher's statement, "All the theory in the world cannot replace talent," is an interesting reflection of this point. From this, it is clear that she also situates propositional, verbalized knowledge, or theory as she calls it, beyond the domain of essential knowledge requirements for a practicing graphic designer, as her use of the word talent seems to suggest that within this context, what is being referred to is tacit knowledge. Yet Scher's statement demonstrates that she herself has perceived a clear division between theory and her own knowledge of the experience of practice, reflecting Niederer's view that the lack of integration between the propositional and procedural knowledge within the context of the academy has indeed led to a dichotomy between theory and practice.
Okay, so how does all this relate to typographic education and research? Well, because graphic design and perhaps to a lesser extent typography and their accompanying discourse are in the main positioned outside of the academy, criticality has yet to come naturally. For example, the consumption of the practice of book design and the consumption of the practice of book history happen in very different places. And the description of the London-based design bookshop Magma here on the right that we came across included the following lovely remark. And yet when you go and look at somewhere like the Long Room Library in Trinity, all you see are sorry-looking spines. Book history, like design history, has a fascination with the material form of books, and as such has a good record of examining factors of their production. Here there's a clear intersection with certain areas of typographic history, where the identification of particular type forms can help in the provenancing of the books. However, too often in our experience, design historians' interest in book designers is limited to the opportunity for the historians to ask about a particular design or printing process, or the dreaded type spotting, a very limited part of the discipline's epistemology. Communication between design historians and designers can provide a great deal more than simply helping understand why and how books were made, out of what. It can also throw light on the whole area of mediation, how text becomes book, which may indeed also be a job for the critical theorist. Critical theory allows for the potential engagement with another aspect of epistemology, looking at the consumption of design, and yes, even typography, its histories of readers and audiences, and at the interplay of production and consumption. But why engage with critical theory or academic language at all? Well, in general, graphic design and typography are considered utterly superficial to the constitution of society, to the point where, as we all probably know, there are few legal rights over the protection of the design of a typeface, for example. Design is still not regarded as content. It's considered to be ornament. Now, a corrective against this is often sought via business models of credibility, a desire for the elusive professionalization of design practice. Instead, we'd argue a strong epistemological awareness, or academic credibility perhaps, would acknowledge the socially constitutive as well as authorial validity of visual communication and typography.
The situation is similar with regard to the apprehension of the social production of design, as highlighted by Ewan, who writes, designers are primarily aware of their work as a selling device. There are few connections made to the socio-aesthetic tradition from which their profession was born. An aestheticism that separates images from social concerns dominates not only the thinking of practicing designers, but also the curricula of most design schools. Okay, yeah. Secondly, it may have caused a limited appreciation or awareness of the significance and value of the expertise and craft of graphic design in a number of spheres, both because of and despite the foregrounding of commercial imperatives at the heart of contemporary practice at the expense of theoretical reflexivity, research opportunities that may explicate and substantiate the merit and benefits of the craft, yielding a significant and positive impact on the extent to which design and its practitioners are valued and remunerated, have yet to develop. In turn, this would in fact protect us against some of the more exploitative and corrosive practices that one may encounter during a career in design as it currently stands. As McVerish asks, why close the door, especially the classroom door, on these questions? Educated awareness of the networks within which graphic design and typography is produced, distributed, and encountered need not presume a latter-day constructivist program of mass empowerment through structural exposure. It need not entail a disruptive critique of normalized power relations. Knowing interaction with the forces that orientate and are deployed by typographic resources can only sharpen practice. In educating practitioners, there is a place for analysis of the rationales that have been proposed for dominant models of typography.
For our final observation, let's strike a cautionary note. This education strand is a welcome feature to the conference. However, is there a danger in sectioning off papers that deal with explicitly epistemological issues from the main conference, and hence the main body of practice? Research is not simply a facet of education, it's an integral part of practice, and a practice in itself. The presenter's challenge, like that facing the educator, is not simply to opt for either entertainment or epistemology, but by putting a kind of intellectual cordon sanitaire around the latter, we may be forcing such a choice. Thank you.